The Opel Omega, both the first and second generation, always had a reputation as a simple, affordable car for the middle class. Not particularly ambitious and not really aiming for any kind of prestige. The problem is, that's not how it was originally conceived. The Omega was meant to take on Mercedes and BMW, a duo that was causing problems not just for Opel, but for a lot of other manufacturers as well. The segment was simply too profitable to ignore. No one expected it to end up with that kind of image. And yet, at one point, trying to strengthen its position, Opel even seriously considered putting a Corvette engine into the Omega. But we'll get to that. In the early 1980s, Stuttgart was already hard at work on what would become the E-Class W124, while in Munich they were putting the final touches on its rival, the E28. These two models essentially began to reshape the entire E-segment. Midsize sedans were starting to gain features that had previously been reserved for executive cars, like the BMW 7 Series or the first S-Class. Around the same time, Opel decided it was time to replace the record. They needed a new sedan that could take on Mercedes and BMW, and they invested around 2 billion marks into its development. The layout remained classic. The GM V-body platform, a wheelbase of 2,730 millimeters, rear-wheel drive, and a longitudinal engine. But the approach itself was different. While competitors still relied on sharp, angular shapes, Opel focused on aerodynamics. The prototype spent around 1,400 hours in wind tunnels at Pininfarina and the University of Stuttgart, and the result was one of the best in its class at the time. At the same time, a lot of attention was paid to safety. Starting in 1983, dozens of crash tests were conducted, leading to the conclusion that the upper seatbelt mounting point needed to be height adjustable. Opel was among the first to implement this in a production car, and that car was the Omega. In October 1986, the Omega A, sold in the UK as the Vauxhall Carlton, debuted as a model for the following year. And despite a fairly modest base specification, it already offered a long list of options, from power mirrors, windows, and central locking to climate control, which was quite serious for this class. And by 1987, the Omega had won the European Car of the Year award, which naturally gave the company's management a strong sense of optimism. At first, things really did go well. Hundreds of thousands of cars sold in the early years, both sedans and wagons, with strong demand from taxi fleets and corporate buyers. It seemed like the bet had paid off. But despite Opel's efforts to take on Mercedes and BMW, that never really happened in practice. And the Omega ended up competing with cars like the Ford Scorpio, Peugeot 405, and Renault 25, simply because it lacked both the interior quality and the brand prestige to match the Germans. The situation was made worse by the fact that while Opel was still catching up to the E28, the E34 had already arrived, raising the bar even further. Alongside the familiar inline sixes, both BMW and Mercedes introduced V8 engines in the early 1990s, with displacements of 4 and even 5 liters and outputs of up to 326 horsepower. Against that backdrop, even after the 1990 facelift, the Omega could offer no more than 3 liters. And although the 24-valve engine in the Omega 3000 produced a respectable 204 horsepower, allowing the car to reach 240 kilometers per hour and accelerate to 100 in 7.6 seconds, it didn't change the overall picture. As a result, the Omega quickly gained a very specific image, a car for older buyers who wanted a lot of car for relatively little money. And pricing only reinforced that perception. In 1992, a base Omega GL 2.0i cost 35,890 marks. The mid-level CD was 40,940, and the top Omega 3000 was 57,325, while a BMW 525 or a Mercedes 260e cost around 55,000, noticeably more for a similar engine size. Of course, there were extreme versions like the Lotus Omega with a 3.6-liter twin-turbo engine, or the Irmscher version with a 4-liter engine producing 272 horsepower. But for Opel, these were never mass-market solutions capable of competing on equal terms with the top versions of Mercedes and BMW. And at the same time, the first-generation Omega was already starting to age quite quickly, which led to the decision in Rüsselsheim to move forward and develop a new model under the same name. In total, around 900,000 first-generation Omegas were produced, including the Vauxhall Carlton. Of course, I didn't forget about the Senator. Someone has probably already written a comment saying that it was the one meant to compete with Mercedes and BMW, while the Omega was just a mid-size car. But in reality, the Senator had even fewer chances than the Omega. Because Mercedes and BMW were not just about status, but also about performance and that same young spirit. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, already established but still relatively young buyers on both sides of the Atlantic chose the Germans not for their past legacy, but for what they were at that moment: fast, lively, and still prestigious. At the same time, that same younger audience was increasingly turning away from traditional retirement brands like Lincoln and Cadillac. And the Senator, in terms of character, was actually closer to them, much like the Cadillac Seville, which also tried to compete with the Germans, but ultimately remained a car without a youthful image. Against that background, the Omega actually had better chances, at least because it didn't carry that aged image, something it unfortunately developed later. And it's also worth noting that the Senator ended in 1994 and never received a successor. The Omega, however, continued its story, and that's where we return. In April 1993, an Opel Omega wagon appeared on the Nürburgring Nordschleife, catching attention with the distinctive sound of a V6. And this was not the result of some backyard engine swap. On the legendary track, in the old body, Opel was testing its new secret weapon, a new V6 engine. Opel remained ambitious and did not give up on the idea of taking on Mercedes and BMW, trying to offer more while keeping the same classic rear-wheel drive layout. At the same time, a serious bet was placed on design. The new model followed the rising trend of bio-design, which looked noticeably fresher compared to competitors still carrying over their 1980s styling. Another step up was the complete abandonment of the base 1.8-liter four-cylinders. The range was now topped by V6 engines of 2.5 and 3.0 liters. Of course, 170 or even 211 horsepower could not fully compete with the 4 and 5-liter V8s of the Germans, but it was already a much more serious starting point. At the same time, the Omega B relied not only on engines, but also on equipment. Power steering and 2 airbags were standard, while leather interior and dual-zone climate control were offered as options. And for those looking to save money, there was a 2.5-liter diesel, with the irony being that Opel was trying to win customers from BMW using a BMW engine, which it actually sourced from the Bavarians. At launch, this worked. In 1994, more than 130,000 cars were sold, half of them in Germany. And in 1995, the Omega B took third place in the European Car of the Year competition, behind the Fiat Punto and Volkswagen Polo. With its fresh design, good aerodynamics, wide engine lineup, and well-thought-out ergonomics, the new Opel initially looked more appealing than its already aging competitors, especially since pricing remained a strong argument. Around 40,000 marks for the 2-liter version, and from 71,145 for the Omega MV6 with 211 horsepower. It seemed like everything was going according to plan, and real competition with Mercedes and BMW was finally within reach. But with the four-eyed Mercedes W210 and the new BMW E39 just months away, sales of the Omega dropped by a third as early as 1996, and after 1998 fell below 100,000 units per year. So what was the problem? A light leather interior, dual-zone climate control, memory seats, a strong V6 under the hood. On paper, everything was there. But Opel was still missing the most important thing: image and prestige. On top of that, the new Omega inherited a familiar issue, a tendency to rust, especially in port cities across Germany and neighboring countries. Even so, Opel had no intention of backing down. Instead of staying in its natural role, a solid, honest, and relatively affordable car, it kept pushing toward the premium segment. By the late 1990s, it was clear that to seriously challenge Mercedes and BMW, A truly big engine was needed. And in 1998, Opel went all in, deciding to put a V8 into the Omega, using a Corvette engine from within the GM family. The naturally aspirated V8 was paired with a 4-speed automatic, and a stronger rear axle from the Holden Commodore was fitted. While engineers dealt with significant packaging challenges, the small block was never meant to fit there easily. By 2000, the so-called Super Omega was already being shown as a near-production car, with performance figures to match. 6.9 seconds to 100 kilometers per hour and a limited top speed of 250 kilometers per hour. But then everything fell apart. Despite brochures being printed and around 30 hand-built cars completed, the project was canceled just weeks before launch. Officially, it was blamed on cooling issues. In reality, the problem was the transmission. The automatic simply couldn't handle the load. Under sustained high-speed testing, components failed, and even after revisions, clutch packs were burning out on the test bench. The combination of the Corvette V8 and that transmission turned out to be fundamentally flawed, and fixing it quickly wasn't possible. It was most likely not just about engineering. GM was developing a global Cadillac lineup, including models based on European platforms, and did not want to create internal competition. And by that point, there was little belief that the Super Omega could reverse the declining sales of the standard Omega, which had already dropped to around 70,000 cars in 2000 and just over 40,000 in 2001. In this situation, instead of trying to revive the Omega with a heart transplant, it was simply brought to an end. On June 26, 2003, the last car rolled off the assembly line, a silver sedan with a 3.2-liter V6. In total, around 800,000 second-generation Omegas were produced. And the most interesting part is that, despite all the attempts to push the Omega into a higher class, today it has a completely different image. A simple, honest, and straightforward car. The very thing it had been all along. And that raises a question. Maybe Opel should have embraced that from the start, instead of trying to turn the Omega into something it never really was?